Welcome, everyone, to a program put on by the Canada-United States Law Institute and the Canada Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center. This program is on the United States and Canada, Outlook for Bilateral Relations in 2021. We'd like to welcome all of you. The Canada-United States Law Institute is happy to collaborate again with the Canada Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center on assessing the impact of an important election. We did this together last year, assessing the Canadian national election, and it's been a pleasure to work again with the Wilson Center. Let me briefly tell you a little bit about the Canada-United States Law Institute. CUSLI is first a law institute focused on legal and policy issues facing and impacting the two countries. We have two presidents, Erica Chamberlain, Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Western Ontario, and Michael Scharf, Co-Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. We also have two co-chairs, Jim Peterson, former Minister of International Trade of Canada, and Jim Blanchard, former Congressman from Michigan, former Governor of Michigan, and former US Ambassador to Canada. We also have two national directors, Kai Carmody, professor at the Law Faculty of the University of Western Ontario, is our Canadian National Director, and I am the US National Director from Case Western Reserve University School of Law. CUSLI focuses on policy and legal issues facing the two countries. We do this through our experts meeting, our annual conference, and our scholarly articles published in the Canada-United States Law Journal. This year, or this coming year, in 2021, we will have our annual conference on April 22 and 23, hopefully in person, but at least virtually, that will focus on the Arctic, and it'll focus on the impact of climate change on regional security issues in the Arctic, on Indigenous peoples in the Arctic, on the environment of the Arctic, and on international relations in the Arctic. So please mark your calendar for that important event. Today, we are here to assess the results of the election of Joseph Biden as the 46th President of the United States. To lead this event is Christopher Sands, professor of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the director of the Canada Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Chris holds many distinguished positions and posts, and he has testified before the federal legislatures of both countries and published widely on US-Canada relations. Moreover, we are very proud that Chris is a member of the executive committee of the Canada-United States Law Institute. So Chris, over to you to moderate today's important event.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I'm so pleased to have the chance to have the Canada Institute host the Canada-United States Law Institute's experts meeting for a second time running. Last year, when we gathered, we were looking ahead to the potential of the election to reshape bilateral relations. And at that time, I was a speaker, but I wasn't working for the Woodrow Wilson Center. 1 year later, I'm pleased to be able to offer to host this important conference at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And more importantly, I'm pleased that I've been with the Canada-US Law Institute now, believe it or not, for almost 10 years. I joined the executive committee in 2011. So this is a milestone event for us all, and to make it truly special, it's my honor to be able to introduce my boss, Director, President, and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Honorable Jane Harmon. Congresswoman Harmon served 9 terms in the US Congress and the US House of Representatives. She has been on almost every important committee of foreign policy, homeland security, and national defense. She's played a major role in shaping US policy and US foreign policy around the world. And now she continues that leadership role at the head of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Started as a memorial for President Woodrow Wilson, and it part of the Smithsonian Institution, collection of fine organizations One distinction, though, I think I'm happy to convey about Jane Harmon is that she has always been a great friend of Canada. And that comes through very strongly. It came through the first time I ever met her, and it has her support for the Canada Institute and for sensible policy and exchange with Canada is just unmatched from senior Americans that I have met. So with that, let me turn this over, the program over to my boss, Congresswoman Harmon.
Well, thank you, Chris. You'll now get a promotion. That was quite impressive. But hello, everyone, and hello to many good friends that I'm looking at on my Zoom, including Jim Blanchard, a former colleague. Anyway, I call myself a recovering attorney and a recovering politician. I say it's not a 12-step process, but I'm not a recovering lover of Canada and the US-Canada relationship, having been there many, many times, having missed, sadly, the Halifax Security Conference this year, where I have become a regular. So we're talking about the Canada and the US election, and I would just observe that over the past 4 years, America has quite frankly exhausted Canada. From the negotiations over USMCA, which was a huge success and a credit to the Trump administration and the Congress. I mean, it's hard to always say these two things work together, and to Canada and to Mexico. From that huge negotiation, some of us call it Nafta 2.0, to tariffs, to defense, to our handling of the COVID crisis, Canada has stood beside a less predictable and sometimes less reliable ally than she has had in the past. And while Canada, I would say, is not only our neighbor, our popular neighbor to the north, but our most trusted ally, the enduring friendship between our nations would not be possible without the talent and grit of our diplomats. So with that, please join me in welcoming Kirsten Hillman, who was appointed Canada's ambassador to the United States in March of this year and is the first woman to serve in the role. By the way, there are so many women, first women now, one of whom, Karen Pierce, is from Britain, and someone I've gotten to know well, another of whom is from Germany, and it is just fun. We ought to have if we ever can get together again, a Power Women lunch, breakfast, or whatever in Washington. I highly recommend that. Chris, you might be appointed for the day or for the event, an honorary member of the tribe. But at any rate, we won't go there right now. From August 2019 to her nomination, Ambassador Hillman served as Canada's acting ambassador to the United States. And prior to that, she served as deputy ambassador to Washington from August 2017 to August 2019. So she got lots of experience. Before joining the embassy in Canada to the United States, Ambassador Hillman held the position of Assistant Deputy Minister of Trade Agreements and Negotiations Branch at Global Affairs Canada, which oversees Canadian trade policy and trade negotiations. Perfect experience for what is going on now. She was also Canada's chief negotiator for the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, which, speaking for myself, I wish the US were still participating in. Ambassador Hillman has held various positions both at home and abroad, including Associate Assistant Deputy Minister for Trade Policy Branch and Senior Legal Advisor at the Permanent Mission of Canada to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. Ambassador, thank you for joining us. I think we'll get all of our technical problems sorted out quietly somehow while you are giving a keynote address, and I will ask you a few brief questions after that before we proceed with the program. Welcome, welcome to this jointly sponsored event. We're so happy that you could be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jane. Thank you for the very kind welcome. And I very much love your idea of a get-together lunch. I can't wait to the day that we can all be sitting around tables again together, talking in a face-to-face way. These are good opportunities as well, but I think we all miss the person-to-person contact. So thank you so much for inviting me. Greetings to the Executive Committee of CUSLI and to everyone else who's joined today. I'm really glad to be with you. So I'm going to focus on two things in my remarks today, quite briefly: opportunities for bilateral cooperation with the incoming Biden administration. And I'd like to reflect a little bit on Canada-US cooperation during COVID times and what I think that that means for our two countries going forward. So starting with the elections and transition, obviously the transition is well underway. Prime Minister Trudeau and President-elect Biden had a very broad-ranging and a very positive phone call just a little over a day after the election was called for the president-elect. The two leaders know each other well. They have a strong and I would say warm relationship, which I think is important. It's not the only feature to being able to work together well, but it certainly helps. They also, very importantly, share strong policy objectives. And they share not only specific policy objectives, but they also share the view that both countries should be working together with allies to make things better, not only within our own countries, but globally around the world. So as we all know, the president-elect has identified for now 4 core priorities: fighting COVID, economic recovery, climate change, and racial equity. And underlying all of those, as I see it, is a strong objective of working with allies and partners whenever possible to increase the chances of success in being able to implement those policies. And if we look at the appointments that the president-elect has been making, I think that we are, and I'm speaking for my country, I think that we're really encouraged because there are a lot of, first of all, there are a lot of people within those groups that we know well, that we worked with before, that we already have good relationships with, but also we see people with a strong track record of working with allies and cooperating in ways to help us grapple with some of the trickiest problems that are facing our countries and our globe. So I think that that is all very good, and we are encouraged by it all. On the Canadian side, you know, our core priorities, as I say, are very much aligned with those 4 that I've just mentioned. But in truth, much like here, job 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 is fighting the pandemic, keeping our citizens safe, following the advice of our experts, making sure that we get ourselves into a place where our lives can return to some sense of normalcy. And while doing that, supporting Canadians as we do it and moving towards a sustainable economic recovery, and maybe taking advantage of some of the things that we've learned through this pandemic to make that economic recovery more innovative, more sustainable, better than it maybe otherwise could have been. There's also great potential between our two governments for cooperation in a variety of other ways. Obviously, on climate change, we have a deep commitment to the Paris Agreement, to decarbonization of our economy, both within our country, but also the global partnerships that are required in order for us to do this as a globe. We see a lot of potential for cooperation in our energy partnership. We have a very strong and multifaceted energy relationship with the US, which is going to be key to economic recovery. And it's also going to be key to moving forward with some of the climate change objectives that we share with the incoming Biden administration. And then, of course, you know, international cooperation, peace and security, and domestic issues that are really front and center for both of our countries, including fighting systemic racism and anti-Black racism. So there's a lot there in common between our two governments. We have a lot to do together. This is a very complex and unfortunately very difficult moment in history, but I think all of the basis is there, both at a personal level and a policy level, for us to have enormous success. Which kind of brings me to my second theme that I just want to spend a minute on, which is Canada-US cooperation in the time of COVID. I mean, it goes without saying that all of us have faced unprecedented upheaval in our lives, our personal lives, our communities, our business lives, you know, across the board. This has been an incredibly complicated and difficult time for everyone. And it's also exposed both, I think, strengths and vulnerabilities in some of the systems of governance that we have, and just some of the social systems that we have, and some of the ways in which we work within our own country and we work with our partners. I have no doubt that we will be reflecting on this experience and the lessons learned from this year for years to come. And a lot of that reflection has already started. I think that for us, and one of the reflections that is really deeply underway right now for Canada is looking at the way in which we organize our supply chains and looking at some vulnerabilities that might exist there in some of our most critical products and supply relationships. The good news there is that while some of those vulnerabilities have absolutely been experienced over the last several months, what has also been clearly demonstrated is that when it comes to Canada-US cooperation economically and trade and supply chain integration, both countries are deeply committed not only to maintaining it, but keeping it reliable and strong. And we saw that, right? We saw that when the border measures were put in place to restrict non-essential travel between Canada and the United States. Those measures were designed explicitly to make sure that trade could continue. And the facts bear it out. We have about an 85% reduction in travel overall between our two countries, but the volume of trade going back and forth is virtually unchanged. Another really good example is in those early days when there was a real struggle to get all the PPEs that our countries needed. We quickly realized that we were supplying each other, first of all, PPE products in great measure. Canada last year, it was almost $9 billion worth of PPE that we exported to the United States, and the US exports to Canada as well, but also the components that go into manufacturing those. And as more businesses within both of our countries were retooling to make some of these products that were in great demand, the necessity of keeping our supply chains open to the components that go into that manufacturing became apparent within, hours, if not, days of those rejigging of our manufacturing bases. And that was a real world, concrete example of why we can actually work together and make each other safer and stronger and more resilient. And what I'm really encouraged by is the fact that it didn't take a lot of, convincing. Everybody realized it very, very quickly. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One is everything was happening very, very quickly especially in those early days. But also we've developed over the past 3 or 4 years, even though it wasn't always easy and there were some challenges, we have developed a very strong common understanding of our bilateral trading relationship through the Nafta renegotiation. And everybody is fairly conversant with the degree to which we kind of need each other. And that's great. It's particularly great in the face of a crisis when you're not sure who you can rely on, you're not sure if your systems are going to stay working the way they should. We were able to demonstrate that in a moment of crisis, we were 100% there for each other. Our lines of communication were open, we were collaborative, and I think it is the perfect tone to have been set for what comes next, which is economic recovery, rethinking the way we do some things. So on that, I would say, we can build on this recent experience. We can build on the modernized framework that we have through the USMCA, CUSMA, New Nafta agreement. We can build on key initiatives that we have, like on critical minerals, where we are actually very decisively and very proactively fostering cooperation in an area that needed a bit of a signal from governments that was something that was important to us, and the strong policy alignment between our two governments. So working on all of those things, I think we're going to be able to move towards an economic rebound, recovery, build back better, that is highly mutually supportive. That doesn't mean that we won't have disagreements, right? Because in a partnership like this with so much going on at any one time, we're not going to agree on everything. But that's where those strong areas of mutual understanding, those relationships, those histories of working together will make a really big difference. So I think it's an exciting time, and I'm looking forward to what comes next. Thanks.
Well, thank you. That was a wonderful tour of the sort of Northern Hemisphere issues, and you anticipated every question I was going to ask you about COVID or the supply chain. So I'll ask you a few other things. First, let me note that I think it was reported that President-elect Biden's first call to a foreign leader was to Justin Trudeau. And if that is accurate, so much of our news apparently is not so accurate. That's good news, because that was the right first call. He didn't ask me. He probably didn't even ask you, but I think that was great. And it symbolizes how close we are, and how much we need each other and how much we can do together. Restoring partnerships around the world has got to be a huge priority for Biden. So in that vein, let me ask you about TPP. I know you were one of the negotiators back in the day, and trade is your bag. It is now CPTPP. It's a mouthful, CPTPP, and doesn't include the US, but it does include the other countries that helped to negotiate it. The concept, as I remember, was that these are all mostly Asian, not all, Canada and others, but trading partners with China, and to create an economic buffer in certain respects between all of us and China was a foreign policy aim. When I asked people, and I was just in a conference, Zooming in a conference to Japan, what are the chances that the US will be back? They're kind of skeptical. And they say they're not sure the US will be back. They're not sure it's at least a first-year priority for Biden, because there's so many other things to crowd it out. And then they start talking about China. So my question to you is, do you think the US will be back? How could it be back in a reasonably short term? And if it is back, is the original aim, as I understood it, you're more sophisticated about it, I think, than I am, is the original aim of creating a buffer of friendly nations, not to block China, but to help all of us coexist and compete better with China. Is that achievable? You're muted.
There we go. Okay. So as to whether or not the U.S. will seek to join this agreement, I mean, we'll have to see what they decide to do. There have been some statements made by the incoming administration that negotiating free trade agreements is not going to be a top priority, at least right out of the gate. And I think that's understandable. I mean, we're all grappling with very, very important domestic issues, health issues, and economic issues. So I think that there's nothing necessarily negative to read into that. I think it's just a question of governments have to make their, pace themselves and focus on what is of vital interest to their country at any one time. So I think that's my understanding. As to whether or not they will come back eventually or come into the agreement eventually, and whether or not the goals of the agreement remain important. Obviously, we think so. We think it's a terrific agreement. We're very happy to be parties to it. We think that having strong rules-based frameworks in which to operate in the Asia-Pacific region is crucial. I mean, there are other agreements that exist in the Asia-Pacific region, but this is by far the most, as we say in trade talk, ambitious. So it's the most liberalizing, and it also deals with important issues that help countries that have economies that are structured differently do business together on a level playing field. So there are, in that agreement, you've got countries like Canada and the United States, but you also have Vietnam. You also have Singapore, and those are two, and Brunei, right, which is a sultanate. So these economies are constructed in very different ways, and that's fine. That doesn't at all impede the ability to trade fairly, but you do need to establish what the rules are in order for that trade to take place. And we're proud of what was achieved there. And hopefully, it can grow when the time is right.
Well, I'm not surprised at the answer, and you said something that I should have said, but setting the rules of the road is a huge part of having trade arrangements that are beneficial. And one of the sad things to many of us who were watching the Trump decision was we abdicated that role. We, the U.S., not Canada, we, the U.S. And I do hope that going forward, we can figure it out again, because part of the policy of the Obama administration to so-called pivot to Asia was to pivot to Asia economically, not just militarily. And this was going to be a centerpiece. So hopefully we'll figure it out. I have lots of other questions, but no time. So let me just ask you one. This week marked the 31st anniversary of the tragic École Polytechnique massacre in Montreal on December 6th, 1989, where 14 women were murdered and many injured. You've spoken about this incident publicly. The Wilson Center is in the midst of its 16 days of activism on violence against women. And I was involved in an event we just did in Latin America, which leads me to ask you, as Canada's first ambassador to the United States, who happens to be a woman. That's how I describe my tenure at Wilson. I'm the first president and CEO who happens to be a woman. How far have we come on this issue? And how far has Canada come on this issue since 1989? And what can we do, given the fact that in many countries, because of the quarantine, violence against women is increasing, not decreasing?
Yeah. Well, that is a very good question. The answer to your question, how far have we come? I think my response has to be not far enough, not nearly far enough, as a matter of fact. And I think that this COVID time in this issue of violence against women, like in a few other issues, it has demonstrated, as I said, vulnerabilities within our society, right? It's demonstrated things that maybe don't come to the fore when we're all very busy doing our normal daily lives, but when people find themselves confined together and find themselves focused in on having their sphere of activity narrowed so severely, we see things that we didn't see before. Perhaps that violence has increased, and there are studies that are saying that it has, which is a terrible tragedy. But I have no doubt that it's been there all along. It may be exacerbated, but it's been there all along. So these are the kinds of things, as I was saying earlier, we're going to have to look at what this is telling us, not only about our economies, not only about how we range our supply chains, but around our societies, and who is doing what in our societies, and who is vulnerable, and who is more vulnerable when things get tough. So I think, the issue around women and protecting women and violence against women and girls, these are crucial issues that we all have to be looking at. And it's not just, of course, women and girls. There are many segments in our society. So we haven't done enough. We need to do more. I'd like to think that there's some interesting work actually being done between Johns Hopkins and, I want to say, Simon Fraser University on the effect of COVID on women in particular. And so first of all, I'm delighted that research is happening. And secondly, I think we should all have a good look at what it says and what we can do about it. And hopefully we'll come up with maybe some concrete ideas for us.
So let's make this one of the topics for our Women Power Lunch in Washington. It's not only that women have a lens on this, but more often than not, girls and women are victims of it, sometimes perpetrators, but often victims. And it will be a pleasure to meet you in person soon.
Yes.
And now the morning continues under I guess Chris is next at any rate to introduce the rest of the program. And what a delight to chat with you. Welcome to the Washington, or another welcome to the Washington Sisterhood.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. It's been a delight. Thank you.
Well, let me add my thanks. And when the sisterhood gets together for that lunch, I'll cook. How's that? Just to be around the table, that would be great. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first panel. And the moderator of that panel is a dear friend and a wonderful person, Diane Francis. Diane is a member of the Canada-US Law Institute Executive Council, but she's also an award-winning journalist, a best-selling author, has worked as an investigative journalist. She was editor of Canada's Financial Post, writes a regular column for the National Post. And because this next panel includes journalists, I could think of no better journalist wrangler than Diane. And so over to you, Diane, for the first panel.
Okay, thanks a lot, Chris. Ambassador Hillman, that was a very sweeping and informative statement. I appreciate it. I got quite a bit out of it. I'm going to now introduce and talk separately to each of my two journalist panelists. One is, let's start with Lauren Gardner, and she's the editor at Politico Canada. So she's working for, I don't know whether she's Canadian, I don't know. But she's working for an American publication and serving the needs of an American audience. So we're going to get her perspective first, and she'll be followed by Alex Panetta. And Alex is the Washington correspondent for the CBC, the Canada Broadcasting Corporation. So he has a very different audience. And so through their filters, I think we're going to get some interesting insights as to what the Americans are interested in terms of the bilateral relationship going forward, and what Canadians are most interested in. So Lauren, I'm going to turn it over to you. So for a few minutes, if you can give me sort of an overview.
Sure. And to answer your question, I'm American, but maybe some people would consider me an honorary Canadian. I don't know. You'd have to ask.
Actually, I'm both citizenships. So there you go. I straddle.
So with the election of Joe Biden to be the next president, I definitely believe that just the general attitude by the US towards multilateral institutions, our allies, the world writ large, it's going to get a lot more attention. There's going to be a lot of work to be done to, in some cases, repair relationships, in others just, pivot to a different type of focus. And Canada will certainly be a part of that. As Jane mentioned, Prime Minister Trudeau was the first foreign leader to talk to the president-elect. I think that sent a signal of the importance of the relationship. That being said, as the ambassador noted, there are lots of different issues that the president-elect's administration is going to have to deal with right off the bat. COVID recovery, or the public health recovery and the economic recovery, climate change, immigration, racial equity. And it's going to be incumbent upon the Canadian government to assert itself, I think, in terms of trying to get the Biden administration's attention on its priorities. So there are definitely opportunities for both countries to work together on the public health front, absolutely, in terms of trying to collaborate to get COVID cases down on both sides of the border, since now it's not just the US anymore, everyone's seeing this huge spike. The economic recovery, how do the countries utilize USMCA to figure out some of those issues the ambassador mentioned, like supply chains? Is there going to be more of a reshoring of certain industries? And if that is to happen, is that more continental as opposed to siloed in separate countries? The border in and of itself, that's been a huge issue for the last 9-10 months, and that's going to continue to be a huge issue. There are a lot of folks agitating for a more transparent system of figuring out who is essential and who is not, and perhaps allowing more travel, more types of quote unquote essential travel. So that is going to continue to be an issue, especially as cases start to tick downward. And then there are just the perennial bugaboos, like Buy American provisions, Keystone XL. Those will be two big issues that the president-elect has made clear in his platform and during his campaign that he's interested in instituting more Buy American policies, always something the Canadian government is keeping an eye on. And he's been very vocal in his opposition to the Keystone Pipeline. So those will be two big potential sticking points for both countries to work through. But there are other areas for cooperation as well besides pandemic-related work, and one of those big ones will definitely be climate change. As President-elect Biden looks to get the US back into the Paris Agreement, perhaps there's an opening there for the US to work with a country like Canada to figure out, okay, how do we, as a more of a continental unit, bring down, reduce our carbon footprint. So those are some of the big issues that I think will be top of mind for folks working on the bilateral relationship right now. It'll just be a question of, you know, once you get through the public health and economic crises right now, how do you get attention paid to some of those other issues?
Thanks, Lauren. That's very interesting. On the Buy America thing, I think that's the big touchstone for a lot of Canadians, where it's really not a federal system either. It's the states can impose, and municipalities can sort of pick us off, and others with the Buy America stuff. How do you think Biden is going to approach that if there is some of these pockets of protectionism, or in fact, is he going to take the side of the unions, which he's very close to, and irrespective of whether it's Canada or not, support Buy America procurement policies?
Well, I mean, I think he's stated that he's definitely supportive of Buy American policies. The question will be whether exemptions are carved out for Canada. There's certainly precedent for that. That's been done in the past. So I don't think anything could necessarily be written off just yet, but that is going to be a big thing to watch as we get into the early months of his administration.
Do you see any possibility of president thus far, president-elects thus far? You see any personality situations which may require problems, which may beget some problems with Canada, or a closer alliance? I mean, obviously, the vice president is the first person to graduate from a Canadian high school to be in the White House, so we're kind of proud of that. That doesn't mean she's going to give away the store to us, but I just wondered if you see either pro or con in the personal lineup.
I think it's going to be a market. In terms of how the two countries' top leaders, how they deal with each other on a personal level. As the ambassador said, it's pretty evident that President-elect Biden and the Prime Minister have a warm relationship. I know a big deal has been made in Canada about Vice President-elect Kamala Harris's high school experience in Montreal. So I think there are going to be maybe some more obvious instances where, you know, you'll see a personal rapport that maybe wasn't always seen during the Trump administration between those two leaders. But that being said, like you said, I don't think that means that, you know, that the U.S. will give Canada everything they want and that there won't be disagreements along the way. There certainly will, but it seems that they're set up to have a good personal rapport.
Yeah, it's really not broken. It doesn't need fixing, thank goodness. Okay, and that's great. Thank you. Alex, I'm going to turn to Alex, and he's with the CBC. And I just kind of want you to deal with the same sort of, give me your answers from the Canadian audience point of view, Buy America procurement issues and other, you know, Keystone and those sorts of things.
Sure, and we can start with the micro. And yeah, so on Buy American, I think we'll have a fairly decent idea, actually, which way Buy American is going relatively soon, I think. I think if the Trump administration withdraws from the WTO agreement on procurement over the next few weeks, or announces an intention to withdraw, that might box in a Biden administration relatively early on, because then you'd have to sort of reapply or cancel the cancellation. Because I think that's frankly one of the most important issues that has to be resolved. If a Biden administration or President Biden were to sign off on a Buy American provision in any infrastructure bill getting through Capitol Hill, the question is, would that bill explicitly state that the United States intends to adhere to its trade agreements? Nothing in this bill contradicts the trade agreements that we've signed. And if you look at the last major Buy American bill, the stimulus bill of 2009, the version that got through the House of Representatives didn't say anything about trade deals. The version signed or approved by the Senate then explicitly carved that out. There were still issues with Canada later, and those required some negotiations on subnational procurement. We can get into those subnational difficulties later. But, you know, again, just to recap, I think the first and the most important decision that has to get made is, would any Buy American bill or provision agreed to by the incoming administration adhere to the WTO General Procurement Agreement?
On the issue of China, I know that I'm among those Canadians and the opposition parties have come out strongly that wants Canada to be tougher toward China and to join forces with the Five Eyes in the United States and so on and so forth. Where do you think the China thing is going to go, and what do you hear about this, the deal that's being cooked up to drop the extradition request in return for Meng going back to China?
I've got to say, of all the issues that involve Canada and the United States, the one issue that I've had the hardest time getting anyone in Ottawa to talk about is anything having to do with this Huawei case or Meng Wanzhou. Just the other day, reached out to talk about I think it was the Wall Street Journal report, and it's a black box in Ottawa. They're not talking about the two Michaels and how that may or may not be connected to the Meng case. However, I do think that seeing the way some of the dilemmas that Ottawa is going to face over China are not going away in the next administration. You'll see that, for instance, bills to prohibit the use of goods derived from forced labor, basically Uyghur labor, have gained traction in Washington. And people who've talked about these bills and testified on Capitol Hill about them sometimes say that for them to be effective, you need to make sure your trading partners have the same rules. And so whether it's forced labor and human rights, whether it's microchips and apps and whatever the US security or intelligence community decides is not acceptable for use in the United States, there's going to be tremendous pressure on Canada to follow suit. And I don't think that goes away, frankly. I think the one major difference is, future President Biden is talking about having a summit of democracies where countries can get together and share ideas for countering autocracy through money laundering protections, through regulations of social media and online apps. These are things that Canada is going to be involved in, and I think we're going to learn relatively soon that with cooperation comes responsibility. That there will be asks of Canada, and not only on the issues we've just discussed, but whether it's NATO and future missions. Joe Biden is a big believer in NATO, but there's no free lunch in life. At some point, there's going to be a security crisis in the world, and maybe there's a greater likelihood that NATO would be the vehicle to address it, and Canada would face potential dilemmas on things like this in the future.
That's very interesting. What about NATO? Is there much? And I'm going to direct this also, Lauren, jump in too after, but Alex and Lauren both. Canada has been a laggard on the NATO promises, 2% of GDP. We're way down. I think we're as bad as Germany. And I just wondered if there's any kind of, going to be any kind of pressure in the Biden administration, as there was in the Trump administration. Of course, he pressured without follow through. And Lauren, what do you think about that in terms of your audience?
I certainly think that Biden, when he becomes president, could exert some of that pressure that President Trump has when it comes to NATO spending. I believe that actually there was kind of a hint of it in his campaign platform. So I would definitely not be surprised. That being said, President-elect Biden will have a very different outlook on NATO. He's already expressed that he values NATO and wants to support it. So any pressure on defense spending is also going to come with more fulsome support for the organization writ large.
Alex?
Yeah, so some of the stuff that his team has written about NATO, and one of the great things about this incoming administration is there's a huge paper trail. It's not hard to find its worldview on certain things. And one of the things, and I'm going to confess to not remembering whether this is one of the candidates potentially for Secretary of Defense or whether it was Jake Sullivan who wrote this, but basically describing NATO as not a protection racket, that there's a lot more than contributing funding to the common defense. There's quality of assignments, not just quantity. So I don't think you'll get the same badgering and hectoring of Canada. What you might get is badgering and hectoring to participate in a mission, as opposed to sort of coughing up extra cash.
Well, that's interesting. That's interesting. On the Paris climate agreement, Biden has referred to, or someone in his administration, that they want China to behave itself. China is completely off scot-free. It's a very flawed document. I think the Paris Climate Accord is actually quite a joke because it only applies to a few rich countries, emissions concerns and curbs. That Biden said that he's going to sign it, but he's going to make sure that the United Nations make sure that India and China and all the real culprits on the environmental emissions side are going to be brought into controls. And I wondered what you've heard on that line, both of you.
Yeah, so I don't know if Lauren wants to take it. She knows the climate file well. I have some opinions, but
I think the Biden administration will definitely bring a renewed focus to the Paris Agreement and some of the flaws there with respect to emissions reductions and how much countries have actually committed to versus implemented. But the U.S. is no stranger to that either, and neither is Canada. Canada is not on track based on studies that have come out to meet its targets. And the Trudeau government has also wanted to increase those targets, to increase those levels of reduction. So there's a lot to be mined there, not just pressuring other big emitters to level up their reductions, but also on Western powers to make sure they follow through as well. So there's going to be a lot for all of those countries to come together on when they meet next year to try to increase the heft of that agreement.
well,
Okay, we
yeah.
have sorry, carry on, Alex, and then I have a question for
Sure.
first question from the audience.
Sure. No, I was just going to say that we've already heard Secretary Kerry say that at the next COP conference, he intends to pressure countries to do more. We should expect to see an annual report, a little bit like the one on human trafficking or the special 301 report on intellectual property. Every year there'll be something on, certainly if they follow through with their campaign promise, there'll be an annual report on countries' progress in reducing carbon emissions. And they've also talked about, and I'm not sure what mechanism they'd use to implement something like this, but they've talked about potentially instituting carbon tariffs on laggards when it comes to climate change. Again, I don't know how feasible it is, but the one country that I've heard President-elect Biden refer to in this context, strangely enough, was not China. I've heard him refer to Brazil and the rainforest, and sort of talking about how there needs to be a mechanism to punish countries that harm the climate.
Okay, first question. On the Biden administration nominations, how do they augur for Canada-US relations? And he points out the fact that the nominations of John Kerry, Tom Vilsack, and Catherine Tai would suggest hardliners concerning Keystone dairy under the new Nafta and by American enforcement. Would they not?
Yeah, well, we saw yesterday USTR requested consultations with Canada over the dairy issue. And with the nomination of Catherine Tai to be the next US Trade Representative and Tom Vilsack to be Agriculture Secretary once again, I definitely don't think there's going to be much of a shift there in terms of where folks in Washington stand on Canada's trade practices on dairy. The previous, well, I guess we can call him Secretary Designate Vilsack. He's the CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council, and they were very happy with Lighthizer announcement yesterday. So definitely an area to watch. That being said, Catherine Tai in particular, she was involved in the congressional side of negotiations on USMCA, liaising with the Trump administration. So she has a very deep knowledge of it. Definitely a known player there. So, while there'll be disagreements, I don't know that everyone's necessarily going to be bad friends, but definitely some protectionist and also just bipartisan support for kind of taking allies like Canada to the mat on things that U.S. dairy producers haven't been terribly happy with.
Interesting, Alex.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Lauren said there, and with Vilsack and Catherine Tai. One thing I'd say about Catherine Tai is she's fairly well known in Ottawa. She's been in a meeting with Prime Minister Trudeau. She's met with Trudeau's staff during NAFTA negotiating rounds. She's extremely well known in trade circles, and was instrumental in helping negotiate the tweaks to the new USMCA, including provisions Canada loved, like on biologics. So I mean, yeah, there will always be tensions. I don't think you won't be seeing anyone going on Meet the Press and saying that the Prime Minister is going to hell. So it's, the tensions will be normal, let's put it that way. But I would really recommend, if anyone wants to have a look at sort of the duality of Biden's approach to foreign policy as it intersects with economics, and this is not a shameless plug because I was not at the CBC at the time, but we interviewed a certain Jake Sullivan a couple of years ago. And this Jake Sullivan's gone on to become the National Security Advisor to the next president. And in this interview, it was really interesting. And with just a couple of minutes, you saw these two halves of this worldview. And on the one hand, he's of the belief that the Trump administration has messed up America's relationships with the world, that you need this return to multilateralism because it makes the world safer, but not neoliberalism. Because in that same interview, we asked him about the story of the day, which was the Nafta negotiation. And he said, a lot of people don't like NAFTA, and not just Trump and not just Republicans. A lot of us want to see a rebalancing of our trade policy to put an emphasis on middle class and working class communities. So that's just, take it from that what you will. But I do believe there are going to be occasional tensions, normal tensions, and less dramatic than the ones we've seen.
Keystone. What's going to happen with Keystone? That's a real hot button. Very, very big optics in both countries, I think.
Yeah, man, I've covered that pipeline for a very long time. It doesn't look great. I don't know why a President-elect Biden would renege on that campaign promise, but there are certainly going to be folks in the Canadian government who will try, or who will at least ask, let's not make any decisions right this second. I don't believe he said that's a day one priority. So unlike President Trump, I don't think we can expect anything on Keystone right out of the gate, just because there are so many other pressing issues. But yeah, that's going to be a tricky one. There will be folks in Ottawa who are going to try to convince the White House that it should be allowed to go forward if it can make it through all of the various court challenges in the US. But it's also been, 12 years since it was first proposed. The situation is very different now. And we've all seen what happens with mega energy infrastructure projects, not just pipelines, other transmission lines and whatnot. There's a lot of folks out there with different perspectives, different political perspectives, who have issues with some of these proposals. So it's going to be a bilateral bugaboo, as I like to say.
Alex?
Yeah, the economics of it lead me to one conclusion. The politics lead me to another. On the economic front, I think it's difficult to cancel a project that's already underway. They've already built the spur at the border, and there's not been a lot of construction on this new leg of the pipeline, but it's underway, and it's hard in the middle of trying to get the economy restarted to cancel something that's already under construction. So that's the economic side of it. The politics of it, I think this president's going to be looking for wins on that will make progressives happy, and they won't be that easy to come by in Congress. It's like getting progressive legislation through this next Congress is going to be very difficult. So you take the wins where you can get them. And what would make progressives in the Democratic Party happy? Canceling that pipeline. So, again, economics says one thing, politics says another, and we'll see soon which prevails.
Okay, the next question from the audience is joint border restrictions to stop the spread of COVID are nearly 9 months old. How do you see border cooperation evolving in coming months? And when do people believe the border will reopen?
When COVID cases go down. Yeah. Not anytime soon. I mean, ask anyone in the government and they tell you, we examine it all the time. We make these decisions monthly. We evaluate information in real time, but just based on looking at the numbers, and the Prime Minister himself has said this isn't going to reopen until things are under control in both countries at this point. So, but that being said, like I said earlier, I do think there will be more pressure, especially among northern border lawmakers in Congress, economic groups, the chambers of commerce, and just local communities who want to see something more happen in terms of allowing different types of travel to be deemed essential as we get into potentially the spring months. That will definitely ratchet up, I believe. I mean, it already really has. But so there are a lot of proposals out there, pilot projects for ways to test people coming into either country, and then follow up to try to lessen quarantine times, for example, on the Canadian side. There's also a lot of unique circumstances like Point Roberts in Washington State. It's geographically isolated from the rest of the state. It's essentially hangs on to the bottom of a Canadian peninsula. So folks there have to cross the border twice to get back into the rest of Washington State, and there have been a lot of issues there. Some of these things have been addressed in some places. People are still logging some complaints. So there will be a lot for the next administration to sift through to try and see what more can be done. Another thing is family reunification. The Canadians have instituted a process for that to allow different types of what people consider family to cross the border to reunite. But that hasn't happened on the US side yet. So that might be another area where we could see a change maybe sooner rather than later. But when it comes to reopening the border writ large, I don't see that happening in the near term.
Alex?
I guess the most important thing to figure out as vaccines start to roll out is harmonizing the rules for standard of proof. Like, do you agree? Do you need to have been vaccinated to cross the border? And then that opens up civil liberties issues and sort of equality, equal protection issues. So I wonder how complex that gets, and whether that could become a bilateral irritant. I don't suspect it'll be a bilateral issue so much as two domestic political debates happening simultaneously. But that's going to be interesting. And one thing I'd say is over the last few months, it's been fascinating to watch in Canada, any suggestion about reopening the border, how you just get slapped down immediately. Even when in good faith, some American lawmakers said, hey, we should have a conversation about the process. And the reaction in Canada was, hell no, we're not talking about this. And I think it's going to be strange when the shoe could potentially be on the other foot someday. If and I'm not saying this will happen, but if it happens that Americans get vaccinated more quickly at a faster pace, you might have Canadians saying, hey, please let us in again. And Americans might say, well, where were you when we were the ones with a more severe pandemic problem to handle? So I'm not saying any of this is going to happen, but I'm saying that this conversation could turn very quickly into one about civil liberties, and also one where Canada is no longer the luckier of the two neighbors when it comes to COVID.
Again, another COVID-related question. The Americans have a huge capacity to produce vaccines, and everybody's signing up everybody else's stuff. Do you think there'd be a point? It looks like, I hate to say it, it looks like we're a little behind the 8 ball in Canada in terms of getting this organized. I think our healthcare system has been far ahead of the Americans, but the other isn't. Would there ever be a situation where the United States would help Canada on the vaccine side? And not that we're going to be in dire straits, but I'm just saying, is there going to be a cooperative situation here? Who wants to jump in on that one?
If Lauren wants to start with the question on licensing, licensing and the practices when it comes to pharmaceuticals, I'm very happy to defer to her. But I couldn't speculate on that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's probably a window there for bilateral cooperation on vaccines, but I think any country's leader wants to prioritize their own citizens, but I think that a President-elect Biden also recognizes the need for others around the world to be vaccinated as well, for this thing to have the positive effect that I think everyone wants. And there was that executive order earlier this week that President Trump signed that it tries to get at that America First sentiment when it comes to vaccine distribution. It didn't seem to have any teeth. So I think that's an area to watch. I don't foresee there being a huge scrap between the two countries on vaccine distribution, but I guess we'll have to see.
This is a sort of a far out one, but well, maybe not. How tough is Biden going to be on Russia? And in terms of the Arctic, where they've been fooling around, up there with buzzing planes over Canada and Alaska. They're just generally a malicious group. What do you think he's going to do as far as Russia, and how is that going to drag Canada in, or what can Canada do to help? Alex?
One of the areas where I suspect there'll be less change in U.S. policies in the Arctic, I think the U.S. is going to be pressing Canada to spend some money on radar. When Russian planes incur on American airspace, the American planes will buzz back. I think the major dilemma on Russia is what to do about Crimea, right? And that's the root of all of this. So it's the root of all the last 7 years, I guess, of tension. And so, at what point what's the solution to what happened under the Obama administration? Because again, that's never been resolved.
And it was on Obama's watch that they did nothing and let it happen, actually, which is very annoying to Ukraine and the people in the region. Lauren, what do you feel about the Russia file?
I agree with Alex. I don't know that there will be, I think President Biden will definitely take a more skeptical view of Vladimir Putin. When it comes to the Arctic, that's a great question, because Arctic policy has been kind of this outlier in the US, where we are an Arctic country, but doesn't get that much attention. And there are certainly folks here in Washington who would like to see it get a lot more attention. So perhaps that'll be an area for the Biden administration to further develop and sink its teeth into.
What will Biden be able to do on climate? I know what he's intending to do, what he's announced he wants to do, and we don't know the result of the Georgia by-election and all the other things, but what is your best guess as to what he's going to do on the climate file and what that'll mean to his continental partner to the north?
Well, he's going to have to rely on executive action, especially if Congress remains split, and even if the Democrats did pull out wins in Georgia, it's still going to be a 50-50 split in the Senate. So President Obama couldn't get climate legislation through when they had a much stronger majority in the Senate, 12 years ago. So legislatively, that's going to be an issue for who knows how long. So executive action is going to be key. Rolling back many of the environmental regulations that the Trump administration implemented, and then also looking to go bigger. Where can we go bigger? I think green jobs will be a centerpiece of any kind of economic legislation the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress try to push. To what extent they have real world impacts on reducing the US carbon footprint. Obviously that's to be determined. But I think those are areas where the administration will look to try to follow through on some of the promises they made on the campaign.
What about banning coal, which is the biggest culprit? What about banning coal?
Well,
can he politically do that?
I'm sorry?
Can he ban coal?
Well, coal, the natural gas overtook coal on the energy market. It's significantly cheaper. Yes, the Obama administration instituted regulations that made coal, not terribly attractive, but the market was taking care of that to begin with. So I don't see a market scenario where coal all of a sudden has a renaissance.
One thing we should keep an eye on is infrastructure, and it's funny because I work next to Lauren. We sat next to each other, and she made me a skeptic when it comes to infrastructure bills getting through Congress, based on her own experience covering transport. But that being said, if again I said
this time, Alex,
every 2 years she disabuses me of this, But basically, even if Democrats don't win the Senate, one potential area for compromise between those two parties is infrastructure, and really infrastructure is at the heart of Biden's climate plan. If Republicans are looking to win back the suburbs, some suburbanites, a high priority in a lot of suburbs is mass transit. Mass transit would solve some of Biden's climate issues. There's potential ground for compromise there in a normal world. Now, Lauren, who's been covering infrastructure for a lot longer than me, could speculate as to whether we're in that normal world or whether it's feasible. But I do believe a climate plan is possible if you define the climate plan as an infrastructure plan.
Alex makes a good point, and it is different this time around because, unless things change and the Biden administration pushes a tax plan through Congress somehow, and also immigration, and then tries to move to infrastructure, that's probably not going to happen. But if you start off with something like infrastructure, where there is innate bipartisan agreement on a lot of these issues, then yes, then something could certainly make it through Congress. The reason why it didn't before is because the Trump administration pushed through a tax plan the Democrats didn't like, and then focused a lot on immigration in ways the Democrats did not appreciate. So here we are.
A couple of other issues. Iran deal. What is Biden going to be able to do there? Alex?
I guess it'll partly be dependent on whether Iran is willing to roll back its basically to return to the commitments it made 6 years ago, I guess, 5 years ago. But I don't know whether that's feasible or not.
In many ways, I want you to comment on this. In many ways, the sort of trampling over the global scene that Trump embarked on actually hands a pretty wonderful leverage tool to this new president. In other words, you want us to lift this? Do you want us to not do this anymore? Okay, fine. But otherwise, our default position is our default position. What do you want to say about that? He's got very, an interesting situation. You could actually argue he's in the catbird seat in a lot of foreign relations situations, whether it's the Middle East or China.
Yeah, I think that's an important observation. Certainly, like we've said throughout this panel, a Biden administration is going to have a very different worldview on multilateral institutions and how to engage on the world stage. But there will be some openings there for the president-elect right now to utilize some of the Trump administration's decisions as leverage when it comes to China, Iran, NATO, like we talked about before. Those could be some areas where, they may not make a ton of changes, at least off the bat, but may be open to tinkering with things if they can get some allies or some of those target countries to make some changes in policy that the US is seeking.
How optimistic do you think the US is and or Canada in terms of the fact that once Biden actually gets ensconced, we're going to get it, and the vaccines start to roll out, that we're going to get a huge economic boom in both countries? What's the consensus? What's the polling? Or what have the economic guys said?
Well, the economy's been dug into a pretty significant hole, I guess. Chances are we'll get closer to the surface once we get a vaccine. I don't have any doubt, but I don't see. I guess debt is going to be an interesting conversation after this, and to what extent do people's concerns about debt to GDP ratio start to act as a check on any stimulus or any spending plans?
Lauren, you want to comment on that? The market is saying a boom is going to come.
I think many hope that there's nowhere to go but up, right? But a lot of that, I think, will depend on what Congress does and doesn't do on stimulus. If the status quo continues and businesses go out of business and shutter, once the economy does turn around, or once the public health situation turns around, how do you get places to open back up again if people have had to, close their doors?
Okay. I think the relationship is still pretty much intact. This is another kind of wild one. What about Brexit in Europe? Biden had a very funny answer. It was a while back, and somebody at the BBC asked him, Mr. Biden, what is your opinion of the United Kingdom? And he just looked at him and he said, I'm Irish. So this whole debate that they're having over the Brexit, the hard border on Northern Ireland and so on. I mean, this is a president who's not just going to take very little interest in this. Now, I think it'll force the Brits to comply with what the Europeans want and the Irish want. But what is your sense of, and of course, Britain's only hope if it leaves, well, it's leaving one way or the other, is to maybe even try and become part of the Nafta arrangement. What sort of comfort level in the United States or in Canada? Of course, Canada's a Commonwealth country, so Britain's more important to us than it is to anybody. But I just wondered what you thought about that. Is there any hubbub about that? About Johnson's ambition to join in a free trade deal with Canada and the US? Or is it way under the radar? Is it only in Canada we care about this?
I think it's so under the radar that like Canada and the UK, I think they may have a preliminary agreement of some sort
Yeah.
on a new trade deal. And I guess that, does that make you a de facto NAFTA member if you sign an agreement with one country? I don't know, but I don't think it would be too controversial. But certainly if it does bilateral deals, it wouldn't be controversial at all.
Lauren, any thoughts on that? Mr. Biden, the new Irish Catholic president of the United States.
Yeah, second one, right?
The Irish, remember, they hold grudges.
But yeah, like you said, he's going to be hyper focused on what happens with the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland for sure. On Britain joining NAFTA, that is not something I've thought about, to be honest.
Well, I guess they'd have to give permission to even have a free trade deal with the United States bilaterally and or Canada. So it may morph into that, but who knows? I have no idea what Britain's going to do on its own. It's quite terrifying, I think. So we're sort of winding it up there. Chris, are your panel, are they ready to go? We're going to take a break, or what would you like to do? I think you guys have done a great job. I really enjoyed the conversation. And oh, okay, here's another one. One more question. Any rumors about who Joe Biden will pick for ambassador to Canada? Will it be a female?
It's a good question. You want to tell us?
Alex, have you heard anything?
Scotty Grinwood's name came up last time in the context of a possible Hillary Clinton win, so I'll throw her hat in the ring again this time. But I haven't heard any names.
Okay, well, that's good. Hopefully, it'll be a professional diplomat.
Well, I want to thank you, Diane. I can think of at least one outstanding ambassador to Canada who was not a professional diplomat, and he's on the next panel, the great Jim Blanchard, and he did a pretty good job, but it's because he's from Michigan, where I'm from also. Thank you very much. That was an excellent panel. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Diane. Great discussion of how the administration may affect Canada-US relations. And now we turn to a panel discussing the 117th Congress. And moderating this panel is a great friend of the Canada-US Law Institute and the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center, Monique Smith. Many of you know, born in North Bay, Ontario, Monique ran for provincial Parliament. She was in the 2003 election. She served in the Parliament. She not only as an MPP, but she also served as Minister of Health and Long-Term Care, a hot topic in the time of COVID. She was also Minister of Revenue and Government House Leader and Minister of Tourism. So a lot of experience in the Ontario government. She went on to become Ontario's first representative in Washington at housed at the Canadian Embassy here, where she was a force to be reckoned with across Washington, frequently on panels, outspoken, but also very direct about the importance of Canada-US relations and the importance of Congress in shaping some of those relations. A diplomat, an educator, and now a senior advisor at Global Public Affairs, a terrific public relations and public affairs strategy company that also supports the Canada Institute. Let me turn it over now to Monique Smith.
Thank you, Chris. Very excited to moderate this panel. We're calling it the grand finale, the third act, and we think that we've saved the best for last. So I am delighted to be wrangling two former, or as we call ourselves, recovering politicians. First off, we've got Ambassador Blanchard. I am never sure if you're supposed to call them ambassador or governor when they retain all their former titles, but we'll go with ambassador. Jim Blanchard was born and raised in Michigan. He's commenced his career as a lawyer. He was a congressman from 1975 to 1983. He was the governor of Michigan from 1983 to 1991. And then he became the ambassador to Canada from 1993 to 96. I think I got those dates right. He continues to be a good friend of Canada and always one with a quick quip on the Canada-US relations. So we're delighted to have him. And we also have with us Congressman Charlie Dent, who's a former congressman, was first elected in the Pennsylvania General Assembly from 1991 to 94, and then was elected to Congress in 2004 till 2018. Born and raised in Pennsylvania, we've got two states here that have been at top of mind to many Canadians and many, many Americans over the last few weeks and months, Pennsylvania and Michigan. And so I'm going to let them both give us some brief remarks, and then we'll get into some questions. Please throw out any questions you have in the chat, and we're happy to take them. First, I'll start with Ambassador Blanchard for your 5-minute opening remarks, Ambassador.
All right, thank you. Thank you for helping us out, Monique. And Chris Sands, the Woodrow Wilson Institute, thank you. Jane Harmon, and of course with our Canada-US Law Institute, Steve Petrus. Also, I want to acknowledge my co-chair, Minister Jim Peterson, who I've worked with for 30 years at this point. Anyway, we're just happy about this collaboration. And my partner really in our law firm, Republican Charlie Dent, who I might add, did endorse Joe Biden. So looking at two guys who are happy about the new president and the states, the role our states played with his decisive election wasn't really close. I want to start out by saying that I thought the previous discussions were all really good. The questions were really good. I want to try to figure out where I can add something of value. And I would start with this. The Congress will need to pass not only a new stimulus and a COVID relief plan, but it really has to include substantial revenue for states and local governments. We keep forgetting that because of COVID, they not only had an increase in healthcare costs and expenditure, but more substantially, a complete drop in revenue, income tax, sales taxes, business taxes, gas taxes. Their budgets have been totally decimated. And if they don't get federal relief from Congress soon, they will be laying off teachers, police, fire, healthcare workers. It will act as a counter to any federal stimulus. So we're not going to have a national recovery in the United States, with or without a vaccine, without strong states in their role. We cannot have them cutting spending right and left to balance their budgets, which are required under their constitutions. I think we're going to have economic recovery. We won't. And that's really, really important. And without recovery, Canada is not going to have a recovery. The impact, both living in Michigan and also serving in Ottawa, the impact of the US economy on Canada is enormously substantial. And so Canadians should be hoping for decisive relief from Congress. The next thing I want to say is that in December of 2016, 4 years ago, after Donald Trump was elected, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had a dinner honoring departing Vice President Joe Biden. And it was an exciting night. I was there. Several of our former ambassadors were there. I think there were 4 prime ministers there. It was a glorious night in Ottawa on a cold early December evening. And it was just a total love-in between Prime Minister Trudeau and Vice President Biden. They both gave wonderful speeches, and I might add, they weren't too long, so I was quite happy about that. So that's where Joe Biden's recent contact with Canada ended, up until his election and the phone call with Prime Minister Trudeau. So I expect relations to be incredibly warm and good. I don't know any member of Congress that views Canada as a problem for us. Every once in a while, somebody from a lumber district or dairy district, but really, I don't know anyone in Congress or any governor that thinks that aluminum and steel from Canada is a threat to our national security. Not at all. And the kind of rhetoric that we had to put up with these last few years, which probably delayed the modernization of NAFTA about a year because of all this foolish rhetoric and name calling, all on our side, I might add. So I don't care whether it's the energy relationship, the environmental relationship, infrastructure, hey, the Gordie Howe Bridge is proceeding. All these issues, we're going to have a wonderful partnership that works. We won't agree on everything. It's a partnership that works, and we do need to deal with COVID and our economies. But the cooperation and partnership, I think, will be a hallmark of the Joe Biden administration.
Jim, you kept it in the timelines. I'm very proud of you.
Thank you.
We're going to go over to the view from Pennsylvania now. Charlie Dent.
Yeah, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Monique, and good to be with my good friend and colleague, Jim Blanchard. Thank you to Chris and Jane Harmon from the Wilson Center for allowing us to participate in this important bilateral conversation. On the previous panel, I was chuckling a little bit when I heard about this trilateral agreement, trade agreement between the US, the UK, and Canada, because I had actually suggested such a thing back when the British were Brexiting. And I had actually assembled a resolution to try to write a trilateral, a resolution of support for a trilateral agreement, until my staff tackled me and said, you know, it's going to complicate NAFTA. We just might as well keep it to the US and the UK. Not sure how to figure out to put Canada in without excluding Mexico. So bottom line is, a lot of us have been thinking about this for some time. But let me just say a couple things about where we are now in the upcoming Congress. I thought the message that was received from this election in 2020 was this: that President Trump was rejected. I would say pretty resoundingly, as Jim Blanchard said, it was a pretty solid or decisive victory. 7 million votes in the popular vote advantage, our margin. And I would also argue so that people were, in many cases, voting against Donald Trump or for Joe Biden, but there were an impactful number of, I'll say, swing voting Republicans and independents who voted for Joe Biden and then voted either largely or straight Republican down ballot. That was the message that I've taken out of this election. We've seen it in a number of states, and probably no better example than Pennsylvania, where the expectations were that Democrats were going to pick up seats in the US House, probably take the state house back, diminish the margins in the state Senate. But what happened is Republican statewide row offices, 2 of the 3, they went for Republicans for the first time for a very long time. And the state house Republicans picked up seats, and so did the state Senate. Held on to a very strong majority. And what happened in Pennsylvania happened around the country. So I look at this as a bit of a repudiation, both of Donald Trump and I would argue the left wing of the Democratic Party. So I think that many people, they tired of Trump, but they were not comfortable with that far left wing. They felt Joe Biden represented kind of a center right or center left perspective, and that he was acceptable, but they wanted to place a little bit of a check on him too. And I think that is what happened, that many people decided to protect their interests with some kind of a divided government. And so what is that? How does that translate into this coming Congress? Well, a few things. I think in many respects, the political center of Congress is empowered. Look at the US Senate. People like Susan Collins and Joe Manchin will play an outsized role in the Senate. because you will, what I learned in the Congress, having served there for 14 years, that, there are a lot of folks on the far right and the far left who are really good at telling you all the things they can never do. That is, they cannot get to yes very easily. And so for those who have the capacity to get the yes, those who have the ability to be pragmatic and reach agreements and compromises, they are going to play an enormous role, as you're seeing playing out right now on the COVID-19 bills, where in many respects, these are backbenchers who are writing these bills and putting these agreements together. The way it's supposed to work is the leaders are supposed to hammer out these kinds of agreements. But that's not happening now, because a lot of the leaders, in my view, are afraid of some of their members, on the fringes, who really don't want don't like compromise very much. So keep a close eye on that. And the U.S. House too. Of course, the Democrats underperformed. The U.S. House Democrats underperformed, and the Republicans exceeded expectations. And Democrats are going to have a very narrow margin. And now with two members, Marcia Fudge and Cedric Richmond, moving into the administration, Fudge at HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and Richmond going to be an advisor to the president. So their margin is even going to be a little slimmer, I think, down to 220. Of course, 218 is what gives you your majority in the House. So 220. Now they'll get those two seats back, but that'll take a few months. It'll take a few months. So they're going to be operating on a thin margin for a period of time, no matter what. So again, the political center is empowered. And in the U.S. House, you have this group called the Problem Solvers Caucus. I was part of it when I was there. I was one of the founding members. But Josh Gottheimer, the Democrat from New Jersey, and Tom Reed, the Republican from New York, are two of the two co-chairs. And they were two of the folks who really hammered out this $908 billion COVID deal. And I think you're going to see groups like that. And that group has about 50 members, evenly split Republican and Democrat. The Senate has their own group. So I think these folks are empowered. Now, for me, from my perspective, that's a great thing when you have the center empowered. Now, the bad news is when you have these types of elections, where in this case the Democrats, took a little bit of a beating. Who loses on the Democratic side? Well, they tend to be the more pragmatic members who represent more competitive districts. So in some respects, while the center feels a bit more empowered, a few more centrist members have been defeated in this election. That's the way it usually works. These folks in these very safe seats, tend to be the more ideological ones and the hard chargers. And they really only ever have to worry about a primary contest to be taken out. General election is really never an issue for them. So on the one hand, the center is empowered. I worried about the dwindling number of centrist members in the Congress. So I hope that's clear. I know for our Canadian friends in a parliamentary system, this might be a little bit foreign to them in terms of how we operate here. But in this system of separation of powers, separate, we have separate branches of government, a separate executive from the legislative branch, and of course the bicameral system. These are the things you kind of have to really pay close attention to in terms of the governing and operating dynamics of both the House and the Senate. And so what else does this mean for the Senate? And I'll stop in a moment. Final thing I'll say, there was a lot of talk that before the election that there were going to be issues out there like packing the U.S. Supreme Court, the Green New Deal, Washington, D.C. statehood. Well, you know what? None of that's going to happen now. Not even if the Democrats were to run the tables in Georgia and pick up those two seats, you have a 50-50 split. And I just don't see any of that happening. They're not going to eliminate the Senate filibuster, which, whatever its faults, in my estimation, is the last mechanism left in Washington that forces some level of bipartisan cooperation and collaboration. It's the last thing there. If the Senate were to eliminate that filibuster, then the Senate would look a lot more like the House. Having said that, that doesn't mean the filibuster doesn't need to be reformed, because it does. But eliminating it is now, I believe, off the table, and the Senate will play its usual role in really, at the end of the day, reaching agreements on all the major issues that will actually become law. That's how it usually works in Washington. That the Senate does provide that balance. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Charlie. That's a great place to stop because it's where I want to start. So I want to talk about the Senate, and I want to talk about Georgia. It seems to be a topic of conversation among everyone, including my mother, who actually watched the Georgia senatorial debate on CNN the other day from North Bay, Ontario. So it's getting broad viewership, and wondering what you think. Where do you think this is going? Charlie, you talked about the fact that people voted one way at the top of the ticket and the other way down ticket, some people. Do you think that's going to hold on the Senate race in Georgia? And then we'll go to the ambassador. So Charlie?
Sure. Ordinarily, and by the way, I should, full disclaimer, Jim Blanchard and I work with Saxby Chambliss, who's part of our firm, who was a senator, U.S. senator from Georgia, and I believe was the last U.S. senator to win in a runoff in 2009, January of 2009. But ordinarily, a runoff in Georgia would typically benefit the Republican candidate or candidates in this case. Now, again, but 2020 is different than 2009, when it's a different world in Georgia. But I give a slight lean Republican, but with a big but here. You know, the fact that President Trump continues to say that the election is rigged, that the vote was stolen in Georgia, you know, in many respects, he's having the effect of depressing Republican vote, the Republican vote in Georgia for these runoffs. It's hard to argue that the system is rigged and fixed, and then tell people to show up to vote in January in an election that many people now believe there's a predetermined outcome. So I mean, that could have a very negative effect on the Republican candidates. I still think there's a slight advantage. I think that certainly Perdue is probably in a slightly stronger position than Loeffler. And I think Warnock is perhaps a slightly stronger candidate than Ossoff on the Democratic side. So I think right now, I still give a slight lean Republican, but because of this unusual dynamic of the president, on the one hand now encouraging people to come out and vote in Georgia, while at the same time saying the last election there was rigged and fixed. I mean, this is an incoherent message, is what I'm saying. And you know, how do Georgia Republicans respond? Do some just sit it out, or do some of them just wake up and say, hey, you know, I actually better show up? So we just don't know. This is a very unusual and odd time. I yield to my colleague.
Sadly, not the first or last incoherent message, but yes, we will move over to Jim and your comments on Georgia.
Well, let me just say, you know, during the election, one of my successors, Gordon Giffen, who I usually defer to for Georgia politics, said in a meeting I was in, a Zoom meeting, that actually Georgia was in play in the presidential race. And I said, what? Wow. He said, Jim, really? We're in play. I never thought I'd say that. I thought we'd be in play 10 years from now. We are in play. This is going to be close. And election night, he said, it's not only going to be close, but we might win in a whisker, meaning the Democrats. And by gosh, they did. But I also agree with, and so I'm optimistic about Georgia. I'm also optimistic about the organization that Stacey Abrams put together, which took her about a decade to do. I think our candidates are stronger. I think that both Republicans are viewed, of course, here's my bias, but they are viewed as rather sleazy, uninspiring, whereas Ossoff is really sharp. I watched his debate with Perdue, and Warnock is very inspiring. So I think we have stronger candidates, but all things equal, as Charlie said, in a special election, generally the Republican in Georgia would prevail. All things are never always equal. But it is true, in Michigan and Pennsylvania, a lot of people voted for Biden and then voted down ballot Republican. It was a big turnout for the reasons I think Charlie mentioned. I also want to backtrack a little and say in 2018, we kind of peaked, we Democrats, in the House. Remember, the apportionment of the seats heavily favors Republicans. So based on the current apportionment, which is going to change, I think we maxed out in our seats in the House in 2018. So in retrospect, I'm not shocked that we lost a few this time. I think it's regrettable, but I do think it's true. And I know a lot of them. And there's at least 155,000 in Michigan or more who voted for Joe Biden. But down the ballot, yeah, they had time for Gary Peters. 65,000 fewer. But after that, they were voting for state legislators who are Republicans. So this Georgia thing will tell us how many Republicans think it's no use voting, it's rigged, or how many of them know that's really an act by Trump. It's really all an act, and it's a lot of BS, and they need to go out and vote. We'll find out. My guess is most Republicans in Georgia know that Trump's antics are all an act. They would have liked if he'd won. They know it's a lot of BS. They know it's grandstanding. They may even know it's a fundraising gimmick. But my guess is they also know the vote was not rigged in Georgia. They may not admit it, but I think that's going on everywhere. I don't know any sane person that thinks the vote was rigged in Michigan, for example. Nobody.
Well, I think it'll make for good entertainment at the beginning of January and this time of COVID for all political junkies. So that'll be fun to watch. And fun fact, Gordon Giffen, in my very first week in Washington, took me out for lunch and introduced me to Saks Beach Analysts. So there you go. It's like it all comes full circle.
Hey, Monique, can I just follow up on something Jim said about overperformance? Jim is right that Democrats certainly overperformed in 2018, had a very good election, in a wave election. This is the Republicans did in 2010, where they overperformed. And the way the analogy I use, when you have a big wave election like that, the wave throws up a lot of driftwood onto the beach. And then, when that riptide comes, a few of those loose logs along the shoreline, they get dragged back out to sea. And that's kind of what happens. And that's what happened. When you look at where Republicans picked up seats this time, it was in seats that they should have never lost in the first place. In Utah, in South Carolina, Oklahoma, even the seat in New Mexico, even one in New York, for example. These were seats that should have never been lost. And then the two in South Florida, a little different dynamic, although those were Republican seats for a long time. And so they just came back. So Republicans really did win in areas that, for the most part, that they should have never lost in the first place. And so it's a little bit of a correction.
Yeah, like I want to mention Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin, Congresswoman Haley Stevens. They got elected in 2018 in districts that were written to be safe Republican. They won because we had a wave, anti-Trump wave, and they were extraordinary candidates. In our case this year, they survived only because they were extraordinary candidates with great campaigns. But normally they might have lost. So the one thing I want to add about all this that Charlie mentioned, he talked about the center and the moderates, and it's no accident that you have the moderates in the Senate, Democrats and Republicans. I think 8 of them will come up with a recovery plan, a $908 billion recovery plan. And I think it's interesting that 3 or 4 of them are former governors. So they realize the reality of the economy and the need for states and local governments not to be laying off people and cutting spending, but really holding the line and being able to use their employees to help rebuild the economy.
So I want to take you back to the Congress and how tight it's going to be in Congress in the new administration, particularly as Charlie mentioned, with 2 members of Congress going into the administration, bringing that number, at least for a short time, that much tighter. How do you both see Congress working together to get things done? I know you both talked a little bit about the center and the center having more power, and particularly in the Senate. But how do you see that playing out at the congressional level, and in particular with respect to maybe some Canadian issues of concern to Canada, like Buy America or like an infrastructure bill? Where do you see Congress going, and how is the slim margin going to play into that? Jim?
I'm going to let Charlie take that initiative.
Sure.
Because
sure.
He's more current in Congress. He was on the Appropriations Committee. He's talking more of the members. I talked to the Michigan people, and I have some views. I think it's really going to be tough. It's going to be really hard on Nancy Pelosi, who I completely admire. She's going to have a tougher job in some respects than Joe Biden. But Charlie is really current on this. So I kind of listen to him.
Great.
Well, thank you, Governor, Governor, and I should say Ambassador today, since they're our Canadian friends. Well, look, a few issues where I think there could be some areas of agreement. We talked about infrastructure for a long time. It feels like the great white whale of public policy, but I think we can actually get somewhere on infrastructure. Of course, the question is, how does one pay for it? I thought Republicans missed an opportunity during tax reform. I thought they should have done something on the fuel tax or a barrel of oil to help finances. But that said, infrastructure is an area of likely agreement. Maybe rural broadband. Another area where I think you could see some bipartisan cooperation on big tech issues. You know, you're hearing all that. It seems that both sides are concerned about the role that the big tech companies are playing in all of our lives. And so that's an area of potential agreement. China. Yes, I don't like the way President Trump carried on China, but I think everybody recognizes the problem with China in terms of intellectual property theft and coercive technology transfers and dumping of metals. But I think the approach, I think if Congress could actually maybe work with the Biden administration in a bipartisan way to come to some agreements on what a coherent policy towards China should look like, particularly as it relates to trade and investment. So I would watch that. With respect to Canada, obviously infrastructure, I think, would be of enormous significance and importance to our friends across the border. Buy America, I would agree. It's a nice bumper sticker. Everybody knows that, but it presents problems. And I would talk about that with some of my constituents. I said, well, how do you deal with our friends in Canada, for example, or companies in our districts or in our states that might be foreign owned, but have a significant presence here? Should we disadvantage them because of where they're headquartered, even though they may be employing significant numbers of Americans? And so, I think I'm hoping that the Biden administration will develop some nuance here. And I think for a variety of reasons, I do think that, that the Biden administration will behave, in a much more multilateral manner, that they will not, embrace what was the America First agenda, which I never liked the term, with the historical baggage is pretty significant over here. And so I think that Biden, I even though he's talked, strongly about Buy America, I'm hoping he does recognize the need for certain waivers and exceptions and kind of weaken it a little bit. I mean, politically, it's very hard to vote against Buy America if you're a congressman or a congresswoman. Very hard. But at the same time, we have to be reasonable with our friends.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I agree with that. Also remember, Joe Biden is very close to the building trades. So it isn't just the industrial unions, the building trades. I have a favorite infrastructure project. It's the Gordie Howe International Bridge. For those of you who don't know that, it's the new modern bridge between Detroit and Windsor, which is the busiest trade corridor in the northern part of North America.
And who paid for that, Jim?
Well, it's going to be paid for by both Canada and the U.S. So don't give me your Canadian grievance now. We're going to pay for it through tolls ultimately. But Canada has really helped us. And I was part of putting that together, I might add. So I thank the Canadian officials. At that time, actually, John Baird, really the minister at that time of transportation, was extremely helpful. But anyway, it's a wonderful project. It will be the largest employer in the northern part of the U.S. and building trades. But I think this infrastructure issue, to go back with what Charlie said, I think President Trump made a huge mistake not leading out with a major infrastructure bill. He could have got Democratic and union support and without losing any Republican support. And that is really, it's been needed for so long. So I hope Joe, and I think he might, will come out with one of those fairly early, some expansion of healthcare, infrastructure. Political reform will be difficult, but infrastructure, how we handle the energy relationship with Canada is going to be critical too. I can't see Joe backing off of the Obama canceling of Keystone. I can't see that. But there are other areas, there are other pipelines, there are other areas where Joe and the members of Congress are going to be careful about how they handle energy. Because Canada's our largest provider of energy and has been forever. And we now have this wonderful benefit of being energy self-sufficient, which is incredible. And I think most people now agree that a carbon neutral 2050 is a good call too. So we can work on these things with Canada.
And that's a great segue into talking a little bit about climate change and green energy. How do you feel that Congress is going to respond? I mean, John Kerry's been out already starting to talk about the Biden administration's view on climate, on re-energizing Paris, going Paris 2.0. Where do you think Congress will be on that? And will there be a lot of a lot of heavy lifting on the part of the administration to try and push that through. Maybe again, we'll start with Charlie and come back to Jim. Charlie?
Sure. On climate, yeah. Look, Joe Biden will re-enter the Paris climate agreement. Obviously, the United States is an outlier here. I think we're about one of the few countries in the world that had not that is not in. So we'll get back in. Although I think that there are many members, probably in both parties, who recognize that much of the goals and objectives of Paris are rather aspirational, particularly as it relates to the developing world, China and India. So I think I do think that you'll find many Republicans will say, hey, we're probably better in than out, but they're not great necessarily fans of the agreement, that they think it's it's going to have an enormous impact. But by and large, I do think climate is becoming a bigger issue, and for the Republicans, in Congress, I think it's imperative for them to come up with an answer on climate. I mean, complaining about AO's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Green New Deal, well, that's not a policy. We can argue, and I happen to agree that the Green New Deal is very misguided on a lot of levels. But at the end of the day, they need a new policy. That's affirmative. And so watch what happens too with these two new members from, say, South Florida, where climate change is very real. And watch for members like that. Some of these newer members who are in maybe some of the more marginal districts are likely to play a larger role in helping shape a Republican climate agenda. And whether or not they can come to agreements with the Biden administration, the Democrats, I don't know. But I think there will be a consensus, though, that re-entering Paris is probably an easy step.
Great. Jim?
Yeah, I think, yes, definitely we'll re-enter Paris. I think it'll be interesting to watch John Kerry, who I also admire and worked for president, as he hopscotches the globe, trying to convince people to do more on climate change and explain why the previous administration wouldn't or didn't, and explain whether America is really back rejoining the world in cooperation, or whether we could snap back to another Trump-like era. So there's a lot of concern around there. So it'll be interesting. Climate will be one of those issues where we work on. I think Congress will definitely support Joe Biden in strengthening NATO and supporting our traditional allies. I think it's really going to be important, and that's part of Tony Blinken's background and belief, is strengthening our alliances and not cozying up to dictators, and standing up for democracy and freedom around the world and in the U.S. So that's going to be really important. But on the earlier, what Charlie mentioned on Buy America, it was really interesting when we had the stimulus with President Obama. There were Buy America provisions, and a lot of people thought Canada was exempt because of procurement agreements. It turned out they weren't entirely. It had to be worked out. But it was really ironic, because you had an embargo like on steel, and yet the steel workers are an international union whose president is from Toronto. It's like the steel tariffs and aluminum tariffs. We have a totally integrated market. So I would hope they'll find a way to work Canada in a reasonable way on the Buy America stuff, because of the integrated nature of our economy, and also the integrated nature of a lot of our unions, including the trades and others. So we need to be careful about how we do this. And Charlie put his finger on it, I think.
Perfect. Great segue into my next question, which is from the audience. But I do want to do a shout out to Leo Gerard, former international president of Steelworkers, who is from Sudbury, Northern Ontario boy. Whoop, whoop.
Oh, that's the moon, right? That's the moon, right?
Suburb of Toronto.
Suburb of Toronto. Well, it's a pretty broad suburb then. I'm just going to ask you a question on trade and our international position. So we had a question saying that the Trump administration had really done a disservice to, I'm just trying to see it on my screen, which I'm having a little technical difficulty. Basically saying that, we had the Trump administration had thrown into disarray the WTO representation. as well as our representation in other trade organizations. Do you think the Biden administration will restore quickly respect for the terms of the international agreements and the functionality of what is now Chapter 10?
Well, I guess I'll start on that one. I do think that the Biden administration will again, re-engage with WTO in a more constructive manner than, say, President Trump has. And as a Republican, I have to tell you that I was very concerned about the way Donald Trump pursued trade policy. And for Republicans generally, I think the United States has about 14 bilateral or multilateral trade agreements with about 20 countries. That's it. It's not many. And it's interesting too. I believe the United States runs a net trade surplus with those countries, not everyone individually, but overall. And so where the U.S. actually has trade agreements, we tend to do better than where we don't. And I guess more troubling is that I think the Republican Party has to kind of figure out where it now is on trade. These types of tariffs that we witness, and I represented one of the largest steel producing areas in the world in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So, and by the way, I've been to Sudbury, Ontario, which is looks like the moon, right? That's where the astronauts would go to train. I remember visiting. Took a good look. And well, to make a long story short, a lot of us were deeply offended when there were those 232 tariffs in the name of national security on Canadian steel and aluminum. And I think it was mortifying to many of us when we recognized that there are trade problems in this world, particularly with China and the issues that I mentioned earlier, and that our friends and allies in Canada and Europe and in Asia, and Japan and Korea, Australia, elsewhere, they're all dealing with the same issues on China that we are. And the idea was to take the Chinese to the WTO, and we need a strong organization to help us in that regard. But we needed to develop friends and partners in the battles on trade with what everybody recognizes are abuses by the Chinese. And it was just for the United States to go it alone and pick fights with the Canadians and the Koreans and the Japanese and the Australians and the Germans or the car. What did BMW ever do to the United States other than invest too much money in? Biggest exporter of cars. We're fighting with German car companies. The point I'm making is we needed to be enlisting our friends and allies. Everybody knew that up front, because I don't think on our own that we could, in a bilateral way, really change the dynamic with China. And it's going to be hard to do it in a multilateral manner too, because the Chinese are smart. They're going to try to pick off our friends and allies as best they can. So I think on trade, I think Biden, and for Democrats, this is unusual because the Democratic Party in the United States has historically been much more protectionist than the Republicans. In Congress, those trade agreements usually were overwhelmingly in the House anyway, passed with Republican votes, and you get a small number of Democrats. In the Senate, it's a little bit more bipartisan on trade. The Democrats are a little bit more open to a freer trade there than in the House. And so, so I think the issue of trade is changing in the U.S. in terms of how the parties are oriented. I'm not saying the Democrats are going to become free traders tomorrow and all the Republicans are going to become protectionists. But now that Trump is gone, will we get back to something closer to where we were, or do both parties come to a more sensible or a more sustainable position?
Jim, quickly on this, and then we're going to go to a lightning round and wind it up. So comments on the WTO?
Well, let me just, I don't really have a strong handle on the WTO issue right now, but what I want to reflect is react to what Charlie said about the parties. It's true that Democrats in Congress in recent years have been more suspicious of trade deals than Republicans, but both the left and the right have been more, suspicious of trade deals. But Democratic presidents, all of them in recent history, have been pro-trade expansion. They really have. And whether it was FDR or Truman or Carter or Clinton or Obama. One issue is going to be, look, if we want to stand with our allies and compete with our, in this case, China, our competitors, then if we want to deal with China in a serious way, then there's every reason to find a way that Democrats can support, as well as Republicans, to find a way to join the TPP. And Canada can be a helpful liaison in doing that. It's obviously something would have to get reworked. to satisfy President Biden and the Democrats. I don't know what that is, but it doesn't make sense to look at China as our major economic competitor without a doubt. And I think in terms of national security, also our major competitor, and not figure out a way to work with our allies in Asia on trade. It doesn't make any sense. There's got to be a way, and I speak as a Michigan Democrat, appointed the Chrysler Board of Directors by the United Auto Workers. There's got to be a way to do that as we move ahead. The reality is that Joe Biden believes in multilateral cooperation. So does Canada. We're back with that. The real issue around the world is whether, as the leaders around the world who are friends of ours celebrate Biden's victory, will they believe that Joe Biden will be, and Kamala Harris and Tony Blinken, will they be able to make sure our arrangements hold? Or will another administration backtrack again because of underlying political problems in the US? That's a big question. I think they will hold.
That is a big question. I'm gonna just give you 2 rapid fire questions. I can see Chris Sands looking uncomfortable. I will bring it in on time, Chris, don't you worry. Okay, here's the rapid round. Stimulus package, before Christmas through Congress or after or never? You got 3 options.
Before.
Before?
Before, but I have my doubts.
I like that. Okay, next, U.S. ambassador to Canada. Jim.
Somebody really good. They don't have to be a quote professional diplomat. Politicians do really well if they love and know Canada.
Agreed.
At this moment, I can't say I know, but I hope it's a hockey player. Okay.
Already named the bridge after a hockey player. It can't all be hockey. All right. I thank you both for those insights. That was a really great discussion. I appreciate you keeping your answers short and pithy. And Chris, I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this. And thank you and the Institute and Cusley for having us. Over to you.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you, Monique. And may I also thank Governor Blanchard, who was one of my first bosses, and the Honorable Charlie Dent, former Congressman, clearly recovering well, holding up the side for me in that now I'm not the only guy here with a tie. So that was a great comfort to me.
I'm going on CNN at 2:15, actually. So I was just going to go without the tie, but that's why I put it on for the next one. So.
Well, we'll pretend you put it on for us. That'll be fine.
And I see, again, Monique, thank you for helping us out. I wanted to mention something about Charlie, though. He's the only member of Congress or former member of Congress I've ever met who's been to all 10 Canadian provinces. A lot of Canadians have never been to all 10. So he really knows Canada and respects Canada. And so it's nice to have him as a partner. I offer. Great.
Well, I have to give credit my father who loved Canada. And when I was a kid, we drove across Canada, the Trans-Canadian Highway. We go to the maritime provinces, but he didn't have the stomach or the wherewithal to go up to the territories though, but he loved Canada, every bit of it. And so he made sure he dragged me everywhere with him. And I loved it too. Every last bit.
Well, now we're
Medicine Hat, all the great places.
Now we're all officially jealous because we can't go to Canada now thanks to the border situation. So you've given us something to hope for the new year, a happier 2021 when we can all get back up to see Canada. I also want to thank our first panel, Diane Francis, Alex Bonetta, Lauren Gardner, and Ambassador Hillman, as well as my boss, Jane Harmon. This has been a tremendous panel. There's also an additional great support that we have, and that's been in the Canada Institute staff. Mariana Sanchez Ramirez behind the scenes, Jackie Orr also helping to pull all of this together, and of course, Tracy Fitzgerald, John Tyler, and Treyon Burgess, all of whom have been behind the scenes, but keeping us as on track as is humanly possible. And finally, let me thank the Canada-US Law Institute, a great organization that sparks great conversations on how rule of law can be part of good Canada-US relations. They've been around since 1971. They're a great partner for us. And special shout out to Governor Blanchard, who co-chairs this with the Honorable Jim Peterson, former Canadian MP and Minister of Trade, 2 great guys who set the tone for this organization. moreover, Dean Michael Scharf, who's Dean of the Law School at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, which is half of our partnership, and then Dean Erica Chamberlain at the University of Western Ontario's Law School, and finally, Steve Petrus and Ted Perrin, who are the staffers at the Canada U.S. Law Institute, who have worked amazingly hard to pull this group together and get the message out to the whole Canada-U.S. world that we're having this event. I hope we can do this again next year. Thank you very much for your time, and let's hope for a happier 2021 and better Canada-U.S. relations.
Thank you.
Happy
Thank you.
holidays. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.